Well, thank you so much for coming, everyone, and a very warm welcome on this chilly February evening to this evening's lecture, which has been given by the Reverend Dr. Gillian Straine. This is the third of our 6-week lecture series offered by us, Sarum College. I'm a member of staff at Sarum. I run the Theology, Imagination and Culture MA programme there. We're offering this lecture series as part of our Science for Seminaries programme, and this programme is funded by ECLAS, Equipping Christian Leadership in an Age of Science. Scientific topics pertain to everyday life. People who are not professional scientists still need to discuss scientific developments that affect government policies and our own personal lives. Christians need to know about neuroscience, health, evolutionary science, climate change and catastrophe so that we can make discernments informed by accurate information, as well as faithful reasoning. ECLAS provides resources for seminaries to incorporate scientific awareness into educational programs. Sarum College has drawn on these resources by adding the topics of COVID-19 and artificial intelligence into our Christian faith and ethical living module for students who are currently following ministerial training. Students engage with these specific scientific examples as they learn, or I should say we learn together, about Christian ethics and daily life practices. Sarum is also participating in ECLAS by offering this lecture series for anyone interested in Christian faith in conversation with pressing scientific topics. Upcoming speakers, so after this evening, we have 3 more. Bethany Solerada will be looking at science and the theology of evolution. Joanna Collicutt will be looking at science and the theology of dementia. And then our final lecture in this series will be David Wilkinson looking at the theology of wonder and science. So please go to our website for more information if you want to kind of see what's coming up on your Monday evening horizon. So as I said earlier, our speaker tonight is the Reverend Dr. Gillian Straine, and it's wonderful to have you with us this evening, Gillian. I'll introduce you, but I'm sure that there will be more that you could say about yourself. Gillian is an ordained priest, and she used to be a research physicist. She holds degrees in theology from the University of Oxford and a degree in physics from Imperial College London. Her research interests include linking healing and pastoral theology with science and religion more broadly. Her publications include Introducing Science and Religion, A Path Through Polemic, and written from her own experience of surviving cancer, Cancer, A Pilgrim's Companion, and that came out in 2017. Gillian is part of the ECLAS project, working specifically on the part of the project called Scientists and Congregations. And she's also the CEO of the Guild of Health in St. Raphael. Do check out their website, just Google that and you will land on their website. They're running an online seminar called Everyday Healing, to which everyone is welcome. So do check that out. There'll be more information there. This evening's topic, I'll just give you a few words, but doubtless it will be much more exciting when you hear from Gillian herself, will be a journey through the way that Christian well-being relates to scientific well-being and how that those two things have correlated to each other. Gillian says she'll be throwing the word well-being out of the window, so it's there in the title, but it might not be with us for that long, and looking at some scientific data so that we end up asking, what difference does this make to a Christian way of life? Gillian will speak for about 40-ish minutes, maybe a little longer. Then we'll have a break, and then we'll come back for questions. And then we'll have some more. We'll have questions before the break. There'll be a break. We'll come back for more questions. So welcome, Gillian. Let me put myself onto mute and we'll go forward with the evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you for organising us. And Ellie, thank you so much for your very warm introduction there. And thank you more broadly to the team at Sarum College for the invitation to speak on the science and Faith lecture series. It's wonderful to be here. It's lovely to see some old friends in the audience. Sorry, to those of you with your camera on, I've spotted a few friends and lots of new faces as well. So in this weird world where we can do this and zoom in, it's lovely to be with you, new and old friends, to talk about this subject together. As Ellie said, my title is Science and the Theology of Wellbeing, which is my favorite topic, and it's one we engage in all the time at the Guild of Health in St. Raphael. So we have that project running, the course that Ellie mentioned, but more broadly, our vision as an organization, which has been around for over 100 years, is to support flourishing communities made up of flourishing individuals. So we're all about flourishing and we're all about well-being. So I'm now going to just attempt to make the tech work and share my screen, so you won't have to stare at me. I've made some pretty slides. Oh no, I haven't done that right. Let me just, if somebody can give me the thumbs up. That look all right, Ellie? I can see you. We can see my slides. Okay, great. Thank you. Right. So throughout the history of Christianity, right, there's always been a focus on bringing health, healing, and well-being into the world. And we can see this in the work of the early church and the development of early healthcare within monastic houses. Many of these communities held, studied, and used ancient Greek texts about the human body. For example, the Corpus Hippocrateum, the writings of Hippocrates, a text which included biomedical methodology and cures for ailments. Indeed, such was the importance of this early attention to health and healing, that in the First Council of Nicaea in 325, Emperor Constantine called for hospitals to be built in every cathedral city of Europe. And today, of course, we can see that in many of the hospitals still in use today, such as St. Thomas's and St. Bart's in London. So today, the healing ministry, or well-being ministry, is a key part of our mission. Traditionally, this is expressed through the Eucharist, the ministry of reconciliation, laying on of hands and anointing, the deliverance ministry, pastoral ministry, and of course, ministry at the time of death. I will end this lecture, I'll give it away right at the start, by talking about how our churches can be hubs for healing and well-being for the whole community today, working in partnership with medicine and science. So this isn't just a lecture about the head stuff. This is not just knowledge. I want to also really engage in why this matters today for our own lives personally as Christians, but in our work in the community. So I think somebody could just mute themselves, because I'm a bearer of very small brain and I get very easily distracted. That'd be great. Okay, so let me talk about what I'm going to talk about. We're going to go on a rapid journey. First of all, what is health and well-being? Funny word, you think you know what they mean, and then you start to think about them, and it always gets a bit more complicated. What do we mean by health and well-being? And then let's bring in science and religion at that point too. Then what is Christian well-being? How is it different? We look at our theology for that. What is it that we can say, Christians, what can Christians say about well-being in a complex health landscape, right? And how does it interact with medicine and science? Sometimes that word well-being, why I'll probably throw it out the window, it sounds like what you get at Holland and Barrett, right? It sounds about something to do with gym memberships, right? And it hints at perfection. Okay, so we need to be careful about that term as it starts. So then number 3, what do we mean by flourish? I want to replace the word well-being with the word flourishing. I think it works better because it more strongly connects with our theology. What is the science of human flourishing? And I'm going to suggest that we can actually turn the whole well-being idea upside down and suggest that illness and suffering are ways, nothing is necessarily to be avoided, no one can avoid them. But when illness and suffering come, they are ways to deeply engage with God and the world. And they're also sources of knowledge, of epistemology. By engaging with these experiences of illness and suffering, we can increase our understanding of the world, which sounds a bit like what science does, right? And even our well-being. Then we're going to get into the classic areas, I think. When people talk about Christian stuff and health, the first question often is, well, do prayers work, right? So we'll have a look at that. And then I want to bring in 2 scientific studies just a bit of scientific data. The first, I've called it electrocuting nuns. I think I'll say a bit more about that later. So that's looking at pain perception. And the second one is what happens to our bodies when we do stuff in community. And I've called that Sit Down Next to Me. And my favorite song is James. Those who find themselves ridiculous, sit down next to me. I think it describes a Christian faith. So the importance of community for health and well-being. And then I want to talk about churches as well-being hubs. So I'm going to touch on a few bits of science in this very popular field, but there's so much more. It's only a short talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about science, but there's so much more. The study of prayer. You'll see it sometimes in the newspaper headlines. Does going to church help you live longer? What happens when we engage in mindfulness to the immune system? What are the recovery rates when people are engaged in social activities? There's so many papers on that, but I want to say it's kind of a funny old subject, especially looking at the science of the health benefits of church, because there's a sense of, I don't know, yeah, duh, it kind of like, we know, if you know, you know, and going to church inspires so many people to health. And there's so much evidence that prayer works, that it's a funny old subject. Science is just discovering what we've known already. I love this quotation from Robert Jastrow, who's an American astronomer and planetary physicist. The scientist has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who've been sitting there for centuries. And I kind of love that image, look at this sweaty old scientist endeavoring to get to the top, and we're all sitting around at the top anyway. Sorry about the gendered language, it's not mine. So in reflecting on this area, it's not just about the head stuff, it's about the heart stuff too. Our experience of health and faith in the world. So whatever, this could be a live topic for you. This could be a difficult topic for you right now, if you're going through something, or you're alongside somebody who's really ill. So just apply self-care if I'm mentioning something that's triggering for you. But as we're going into this stuff, I really want to encourage you to make that move from the rational, the head stuff around what I'm saying, to what does this mean for you as a Christian, if you identify as a Christian? What does it mean for your own life? What does it mean for your vocation? What does it mean for your work within the church? And I suggest, as you're listening to the lecture, there's 3 key questions that maybe you might want to scribble down or have in the back of your head, right? So as I'm talking about the scientific evidence around health, well-being, and faith, my question is this: to what degree do you rely on scientific evidence to back up your faith in God? And that's about apologetics. How will you use the science to defend your faith? Will you? Do you want to? Is that where you're at? Secondly, and this is a key one that maybe lots of your science and faith lecturers have talked about: to what degree is God able to manipulate the physical world? Because that's also what we're talking about here. The causal joint. Where does it touch in? And that might be a discussion about miracles. We can come back to that in the questions if you wish. So we've got apologetics questions, we've got handling miracles questions. And finally, to what degree do these investigations on the relationship between science and faith impact on your life and your vocation? And I think that's a question of missiology. We are all called to make new disciples, and we're all called to heal. What does this stuff that I'm going to talk about for the next 40 minutes mean for you personally? And that's a question of missiology. So let's get into it. What do we mean by well-being? So this is a definition of well-being from the World Health Organization. Well-being is a positive state experienced by individuals and societies. It is a resource for daily life and is determined by social, economic, and environmental conditions. Well-being encompasses quality of life and the ability of people and societies to contribute to the world with a sense of meaning and purpose. Focusing on well-being supports the tracking of the equitable distribution of resources, overall thriving and sustainability. A society's well-being can be determined by the capacity to which they are resilient, build capacity for action, and are prepared to transcend challenges. Now, within the UK government's understanding of well-being, there is a key focus on health as a key part of that they do a lot of resource building around. So let me just focus on what is health now. So this is World Health Organization on what is health. You might have seen this before. It's obviously a bit of an earlier statement, 1948. According to the World Health Organization, back then at that point, they defined health as this: a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease. Now, about 5 minutes after they published this, I'm sure somebody said, well, hang on a second. There's a whole bunch of other things you've missed out, most notably perhaps for us, spiritual well-being. But also there's a bit of a question about perfectionism in the statement, isn't there? I mean, complete physical, mental, and social well-being. Has any of us ever had that? I think that's what we think happens after we die, right? So there's obviously some problems with this definition that we might want to draw attention of. And over the years, the world going back to a more global understanding of health. This is one that is published by the United States Center for Disease Control, particularly post-COVID. Our health is interrelated not only with one another, with our human communities, but also with animal health and environmental health. So this is One Health. And the World Health Organization has adopted this One Health approach to understand the complex way that health is related to our world and our place in it. One Health is an integrated, unifying approach to balance and optimize the health of people, animals, and the environment, particularly important to prevent large-scale pandemics. It works across sectors, across disciplines, and across communities at various levels of society in order to build long-term and sustainable solutions. And I think in this, this is another lecture, isn't it? How much this relates to our doctrines of creation and so on. But we don't have time to go there tonight. But it is fascinating to see, oh yes, we recognize that as Christians. So let's go back to this, what is health, and introduce some Christian definitions of health and healing as well. And this is vital. So the first is from the World Council of Churches. So having booted the World Health original 1946 statement out the road, this is, I think, quite a good definition of health. Health is a dynamic state of well-being of the individual and society, of physical, mental, spiritual, economical, political, and social well-being, of being in harmony with each other, with the material environment, and with God. It's a nuanced, encompassing view of health that takes account of all the different aspects of being alive and our relationship with God. I just want to throw in one more that I think that first one's fine. That's great. But actually, I love this quotation from Moltmann. It's rather radical and challenging. Health is the strength to live, the strength to suffer, and the strength to die. Health is not a condition of my body. It's the power of my soul to cope with varying degrees of that body. And I love that. And again, we don't have time to go into depth, but this is all about resurrection. If we are people who believe in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, a body that's scarred by his suffering, we can't just shush away suffering as an embarrassing little interlude we're supposed to get over. It's at the heart of what it means to be human, and it's at the heart of what we live and die by with the faith. So this is a much more radical, you don't get this down the GP surgery, right? But this is what we're about. So let's move on. That's what is health. So having identified that, perhaps we're already seeing that clash with what you get at the doctors, and how perhaps the question already is how do we get science to study these understandings of health and well-being? But where both science and faith agree is that they both, science and theology, can be said to be broadly in agreement that health is related to the complexity of relationships that we live in, and it's multifaceted. So let's begin to focus down a little more now and look at human health alone and how it's determined when things go wrong. Thinking about illness and suffering is like a fast track route to understanding what well-being is about, I think. When we get ill or diagnosed with chronic conditions, it's fascinating to understand sort of the networks and backgrounds and relationships that can be related to this. Now, this diagram is from an American study, but it's often used within Public Health England. So what produces health? What are the overall contributors to health outcomes? And what I want to draw your attention to, health outcomes. So if you get ill, what happens afterwards? Only 20% of it is down to clinical care. The rest of the things that create health, when you're faced with illness and suffering, there's a whole host of other contributing factors. Things like where we live, our financial background, whether we've suffered from traumatic experiences in early life. The Adverse Childhood Study shows this clearly. Things that people don't have choice about. If they can't move house, they live in a smelly, dirty city with loads of fumes around and high levels of noise pollution, you're less likely to have a good clinical outcome. And what's implicit on this slide, I think, and the thing I want to draw attention to, is that we're quite obviously not just machines to be fixed. If so, 100% would be down to clinical care alone. We are complex bodies, and it's not like we just need a mechanic to fix us when we go wrong. We have bodies, yes, but we also have our emotional life, and we have a spiritual life as well, and we exist within societies, and our health needs to be understood as such. And when things go wrong, our recovery and our journey back to well-being has got to be understood as such. Now, science calls this the biopsychosocial model understanding of the human being. We have that body, but we also have minds, and we live in communities. Now, what haven't I mentioned so far, or at least not much? It's the spiritual aspect of our identity. So let's look at that now. And that's key for understanding. If we want to understand what Christians bring to the debates around health and well-being, we need to understand what is our spiritual understandings of ourselves. We also need to ask questions around what happens when we suffer, and how our faith comes into play at that point. So, human identity is formed by a number of factors: genetics, our childhood, our experiences, our choices, our vocation, our social life, our values, our ethics, our gender, our habit, our culture, our social life, our family life, and our faith life, to name but a few. The things that determine our identity are huge, and our identity is subject to some degree about what happens to us, including suffering and life-changing events. To make this point, just think about how you might introduce yourself at all these different places: at a course in Sarum, at a business meeting, after church, at a bus stop, at a funeral, at the dentist. How you introduce yourself in those situations might change. What's important in one situation is not important in the next. But I don't think you would, I hope, say that your core identity changes, but how you describe your identity might. So our identity is also related to the stories that we tell about ourselves. If we're talking about finding the links between Christianity, science, and well-being, I suggest one of the quickest ways to get into the subject is to talk about what happens when things go wrong, when there's suffering. And in terms of human identity, illness and sickness has the potential to affect many areas of our identity, both in the short and the long term. It can affect particular aspects of our identity, for example, what we believe, what we value, and how we spend our time. There can be physical impacts, there can be social impacts, and there can be psychological, existential impacts as well, especially when we think about serious illness or chronic condition and serious accidents. When the suffering is deep and multifaceted, it can, as Simone Weil says, leave a trace upon our souls. It can alter who we are. So if we're going to understand well-being at a deeper level, not just what you get at the gym, then the definition should also work when things go wrong. So for the Christian faith, what this means is finding well-being in a world that we believe God's made and that God loves us, but sometimes the most awful things happen. When illness and suffering come as Christians, we need to be able to explain how we can reconcile that God loves us with this suffering, Simply put, we need to join together the idea that we're made in the image of God, loved by God, with the reality of life on earth. We need to be able to have an understanding of ourselves and our identity in the world that we actually live in, not in an idealized world. So bridging that gap between the world as it is and the world that we believe in, being with people who are trying to bridge that gap, bringing into play the healing love of God. That's the healing ministry of the church. And this is what Christianity offers the well-being market. To make a big sweeping statement, we can offer well-being and flourishing when people are there because of our faith in the resurrection. And the work of the Christian, the work of telling people about this well-being, telling people about this flourishing, is around helping people find out who they are now, their identity, when they're facing suffering in this world. So I'm sorry, that says 2, that's a mistake. So we're going to talk about well-being and healing. I just want to quickly touch on the healing miracles super fast. We don't have much time today, but they're really important because they are at the basis of how we understand healing and well-being in the world today. Jesus told all his disciples, just do 2 things, make new disciples and heal. And we base what we believe that word healing means on his example. He went to the poor and the ill and he touched them and so on, but also what he did in the healing miracles. They tell us what Christian healing and well-being is all about. So first of all, the healing miracles tell us about Jesus, that he embodied the compassion of God. He was the one they were waiting for, right? And he had the power to save. But what do the healing miracles tell us about healing as well? Let's have a look at this. First of all, there were actual healings. Now, it sounds like I might be stating the obvious, and I am, but it's important to be clear. The miracles of Jesus led to actual physical healing and all the rest of it. The people who he had healed had been lame, outcast, bleeding, paralyzed. Then they were not. But these were one-off events, right? Everyone who he healed would have got sick and died at some point, obviously. And he didn't heal everyone he met. So they can never just be about that instant, I wish I could click my fingers, I can't, instant healing. It's not about that. It's great for the people he healed, but they demonstrate something deeper and more significant. What is that? Well, in every single one of those healing miracles, the ill re-entered community. Think of anyone you like, the paralyzed man being lowered, the demoniac, the woman with the issue of blood, whichever one, each and every one of them re-entered community. There's often an element of forgiveness and reconciliation. The healing miracles are about harmonious relationships, resolving alienation, release or remission from sin, and whatever held them back from full participation in the community. So the healing, they re-entered community. There's a bit to grab onto about Christian well-being. They re-entered community and they re-established the relationship with God. For each of the healed, there was a profound restoration of the relationship with God. They could re-enter the temple and sacrifice. You can't sacrifice, you can't go to heaven. You are at a distance from God. Each of them could re-establish their relationship with God. So in all of these, the healing miracles of Jesus Christ show us what health and healing is about today in the Christian church, as it has been for the last 2,000 years. It is about our it's about our profound healing of relationships with God. It is about our re-entering into full life and community. It's about re-entering into full relationship with God so that we can fulfill our purpose, so that we can find our vocation. This is what we offer the world today, right? So I've got this theology of healing here. Let me read it to you. So this is our theology of healing, our theology of well-being, what we're about today. So Christian healing does not necessarily mean just being perfect or getting better. It's an experience which leads to a holistic, positive change in self-identity and an increase in well-being. It's a transformational experience in which the ill, or indeed everyone, we all need this, right, are reconciled with their status as beloved children of God, where we resonate with God's love and find peace. Part of the transformation might be a sense that we see the world anew, that we have new vision, that we have new purpose. It's a life-giving transformation, which leads to a reframing of circumstances. Healing is about reconciliation and human flourishing. That word again, flourishing, keep coming back to. I much prefer that word. It's about, and this can apply in all stages of life. When you're fit and everything's going well, or when you're diagnosed with an illness, or even indeed when we're facing death, because it's about reconciliation with God and finding deep peace. So Christian healing, what we offer into the well-being market, does not necessarily mean getting better. It's that holistic definition I've just outlined. It's about human flourishing. Now, I want to move on to some science research about the impact of faith and spiritual practices, but I want to make a slightly deeper point here before we move on and have a little foray into epistemology and what's the word? I can't remember the word. Phenomenology. So this idea we can find out knowledge about through our experiences. And for me, this is really key because as a cancer survivor, there's something really important and liberating by saying to the ill, those that are often ostracized in our society, that actually this is terrible what you're going through, and it's awful, but this is an opportunity in which if you can be freed from the sort of power that medicine have over us, this is an opportunity to really take a deep dive into the human experience, and a challenge there to see what you find when you reflect on your own experience. I've lost my place now. I went off on one. The Christian faith offers access to holistic flourishing, which is about connection in mind, body, and spirit, because it's about connection with God. This is at the heart of the well-being that faith allows access to. Now, seeking this type of well-being is never an individualized task. It transcends the hollow well-being industry where the focus is relentlessly on me and my goals, my body, my life. So we can talk about flourishing even when there's something wrong with our bodies, as I've just outlined in that sort of theology of healing. And can we turn it upside down, I wonder, and see illness as a possibility for understanding the world better? Now, this invites the intriguing idea that an interpretation of illness might lead to knowledge which transcends the individual. Could the pursuit of well-being or Christian flourishing give us access to deep truths about existence? Should well-being, or the pursuit of well-being, be considered as an epistemology? Now, building on phenomenology, that's using our experiences to understand or to get to knowledge, and existential theology, which is seeking knowledge about God through our experiences, with its origins both in the 20th century, and noting models of interdisciplinary hermeneutics, so that taking different disciplines and putting them together. So when, let's think about the science of cancer and putting it with our theology and see what happens, right? That's interdisciplinary hermeneutics of the experience of illness. Some people have done that to offer into the academy the study of the science of ill health in order to uncover theological interpretations which aid healing from the experience. So this is a fancy way of saying and studying meaning making when we look at the experience of ill health. So I've had this terrible experience. What does this mean to me? I believe this. So let's put these two things into conversation, a terrible experience with my theology, and see what happens. Now, what happens when people are allowed to do this or facilitated to do this? First of all, control might be regained by the ill who are so often subject to a medical system where the body is understood just as a machine to be fixed, and where not enough close attention is paid to the human experience. So, could science, theologically considered, deepen self-understanding? When time is taken to reflect on the meaning of the experience, which will be personal, what happens is that control of the story is taken back from the medical establishment and given to the ill person. Indeed, Susan Sontag, who wrote some really important books around illness as metaphor, looking at both cancer and AIDS. She wrote that an experience of suffering and limitation gains meaning if put in a social and cultural context. The field of narrative medicine supports the idea that when the ill are allowed to tell their story of ill health, meaning and healing is found in the telling. And the key text for that one is Arthur W. Frank, The Wounded Storyteller. There's something so healing about storytelling in illness, which will naturally involve, however academic you are, which will naturally involve, well, I'll tell this story. What does this mean for my understanding of God and my understanding from my place in community? So storytelling is a vital tool, I think, in understanding illness, and also finding healing from that experience, because it liberates you from what other people's stories of your illness might be. The storytelling helps us find meaning, the purpose now of my life, not before I was ill, but the purpose now. Furthermore, trauma recovery suggests that when the spiritual meaning of an embodied experience of trauma is sought, then not only is some level of healing possible, but growth and happiness and personal satisfaction can be seen. So when people go on that journey to find the meaning of the illness, they have this thing called post-traumatic growth, which is, a deepened sense of well-being. Not just I'm feeling a bit better, but I'm feeling much better. So yeah, a huge healing, well-being possibilities to taking seriously experiences of ill health and putting them in conversation with what we believe about life. Does prayer work? Yeah, so let's talk about this. So this is like, change tack. And I want to put this in the lecture because so often people will say, and I run a healing organization. It doesn't happen too much, but occasionally I'll get attacked on social media for this, oh, you run a healing ministry. Well, let's just shut all the hospitals then, shall we? That kind of stuff. So most mornings I get up and have a look at the abuse on social media because it's there. And this is why this topic is so important for apologetics. If we're going to be Christians in the public square, as Ellie mentioned at the start, we have to defend why on earth we go to church on a Sunday and pray. Do we think it's going to make a difference? What do we think we're doing? What if it works? What if it doesn't work? These are really important questions. So let's dive into the science. So first of all, yes, I think my answer to that question is yes. So just to put that on record in case any questions arise, yes, but that's not what we're really asking. In a lecture about science and religion, we're saying yes, but can you measure it? So I can never say the word efficacy, like the effectiveness of prayer is usually the first topic that springs to mind when people think about the links between faith and health. Because we're always at it, aren't we? We're always praying for folk. You might say quite often, can I pray for you? We're always talking about it. In fact, a recent study showed that 80% of Americans pray for their own health. So we not only pray for others, we pray for ourselves. And there have been multiple papers around since 1965 on the impact of prayer. I'm going to mention two of them. In these studies, the influence of prayer on health is investigated by conducting what they call double-blind clinical trials. So in case you don't know what that is, that means that, there's a group of people who are ill and another group of people who pray for them. Neither the patients or the doctors or the study administrators know who's praying for who, or who's praying for how long, or how close they are, anything like that. It's all blind. Nobody knows what's happening. The people doing the praying, the intercessors, could be local or national, and there's a variety of the number of times they're supposed to pray for the person. Many papers have been published showing that prayer at a distance seems to have some kind of impact. The two I want to mention, one published in 1988 in the Southern Medical Journal, published by Randolph Bird. Now, he studied intercessory prayer in treating cardiac care unit patients. Among the prayer group as compared to the controls, so that's those who weren't prayed for, the article reported that those who were prayed for, there was lesser incidence of number of complications such as congestive heart failure, pneumonia, need for diuretic therapy, and respiratory intubation. So 5 to 7% fewer incidences of those people who were in hospital if they were prayed for. Bird found no significant difference in death rate, length of time in hospital, total days hospitalized. So he found there was impact in how well some people recovered, but not overall difference in whether or not they died or how long they stayed in hospital. His work was replicated in 1999, W.S. Harris et al. Attempted to replicate, and he too found prayer was not to have any influence on how long patients stayed in the intensive care unit, but did have a significant influence on life-threatening physical events and complications. Patients who were prayed for did 10% better than others who were not. So there you go. There's some science. What do you make of that, right? These are always hugely controversial papers. They generate other papers, and they sometimes even get into the Daily Mail. That's how interested people are in this science. It's controversial for many reasons. Broadly around causal joint. So can God interfere in the world, and can science measure it? Is broadly where the theological questions arise. So many scientists would accept that prayers for oneself might have a benefit, because when we pray for ourselves, that might lower our stress levels, create a framework of meaning, which all might have a biopsychosocial effect on us. So science, oh, I can buy that. That doesn't sound too bad. Likewise, if you know someone's praying for you, that could have the same physiological effects. That would make us feel cared for, safe. That could have physiological effects. And science said we'll go with that. But prayers having an effect, even if you don't know you're getting prayed for somebody on the other side of the country, there's a lack of scientific epistemologies that allow this to be accepted. And then at that point, you've got a clash on understanding of the world. And there's often big questions at that point about bias and methodology as well. We don't have time to go too deeply into it, but there's always power games and politics when we talk about science and medicine. Who has the power to define human healing? What is allowed to be tested? The weight of the academy, and indeed nearly all research funding, is hugely on the scientific side. Who peer reviews journals? Who allows studies to take place? This is a question about theology. This is a question about scientific method, but it's also a question about power and politics too. So what do we do with these results? Do they boost your confidence? This is my question to you. Do they boost your confidence in prayer and practice? Or do they make you hesitant? Are not these studies in some way putting God to the test? Pretty sure we're not supposed to do that. Or are they violating the basic setup of Christian theology that God is beyond the natural order? Science tests the material world around us. God is over and above the material world. What is God really subject to our scientific methods of study as well? So big questions. I'm not going to tell you what I think. I'm really interested in what you think. This is for you to answer. Next slide. Oh, sorry. Electrocuting nuns. Right. I want to, so that was around does prayer work? I want to talk now about a really intriguing study that came out by a psychologist, a group, but led by a psychologist called Miguel Ferreiras, working in pain perception during intense religious experience. So now we all know that the brain can control the way we feel pain. Pain's fascinating as well. And sometimes the more you think about something, the more it can hurt, right? So I'm actually going to the dentist tomorrow. I've got to get a crown. I'm really scared. And if I think about it too much, my tooth will start hurting. And I'm sure that's not just me, okay? So brain processes and pain are all interlinked. So what did Miguel Ferreiras do? Well, in 2008, him and a group of researchers worked with 12 practicing Catholic nuns and 12 non-religious volunteers. And they were volunteers. No one was made to take part in this. And he submitted both groups to an electric shock while they were in an MRI brain scanner. And as they were in the scanner, they were showed either a religious or a non-religious image while registering their brain activity. After this, the subjects were asked to record the intensity of the pain they felt during the pulse, as well as their like or dislike for images. Now, the images that were chosen were either a painting of the Virgin Mary or another painting by Leonardo da Vinci that looked quite similar, but was quite obviously not the Virgin, just a normal lady. And but they look quite similar. So you've got an MRI scanner, you've got sometimes nuns, sometimes atheists, sometimes religious pictures, sometimes not, electrocuted. See, and then what did they report afterwards? Now, interestingly, it was found that the religious group reported much less pain if looking at the Virgin Mary during the electric shocks, despite the fact that both groups had previously been shown to have similar pain sensitivities. When commenting on the images, the Catholic nuns, as expected, expressed a higher liking for the Virgin Mary, while the non-religious group preferred the Da Vinci painting and even had negative feelings towards the Virgin. These observations support the idea that the changes in pain perception were linked to the religious content of the Virgin image and not the result of a preference towards one image or the other, since the non-religious group had no pain score changes while watching the preferred Da Vinci image. Further supporting the hypothesis, when the volunteers' brains were analysed during the experiment, it revealed that with Catholics and the Virgin image, the pain itself was given a more positive meaning, and in this way diminished associations with suffering. This is supported not only by the fact that none of the non-religious subjects registered changes in the pain scoring, but also by the religious content comments of the Catholic group when describing their feelings in front of the image of the Virgin Mary. They said they felt calm down and peaceful, even taken care of. And what that's about is a framework of meaning. So they were in this tube. I don't know if you had an MRI scan. It's a really uncomfortable thing anyway. But in this tube, and they were shown a religious image which meant something to them, and their perception of the pain was lower because it had a framework of meaning around it as well. And now the third example to link religion or faith with well-being is this one. I'm just going to move something in my slides so I can see. Okay, it's a really fancy word, psychoneuroimmunology. Now this long word describes a study of how the immune system is affected by environmental, social, and cognitive emotional processes as mediated by the brain. Psychoneuroimmunology. So this sounds a bit fancy, but if you've ever got a cold when you've gone on holiday after a period of stress, I can't see you all, but I'm sure at least one person must be nodding, because it usually happens to me. If you're all stressed out, you go on holiday, you relax, and then suddenly you get ill. That's studied by folk who describe themselves as psychoneuroimmunologists. So stress has a big impact on our immune system, right? The studies have shown that when humans are doing group activities, such as singing or working together, there's a measurable positive impact on our immune system. Further, in recovery, spiritual practices such as prayer, meditation, and physical exercise can boost the immune system. So the stuff we kind of do in church, like sing songs with other people, do group activities together, pray in silence, has a measurable impact on our immune system, which obviously doesn't need to be said, vital for human health and healing and recovery. And to so there's an obvious link there. So being in community can boost our immune system. So the importance of community shines through in so many studies of well-being. So many, I can't begin to mention enough in this, but the importance of doing stuff together. We're social beings. We're supposed to be together. And of course, in the pandemic, that was rammed home with such glaring pain, all those people by themselves and people's humanity getting diminished because we were not with one another. The study of evolution have shown that connection is deeply important to our physical and psychological health. Being connected to one another, whether that is in a building on a Sunday morning or laying on of hands when you're praying for the ill, can make us feel deeply safe and have a measurable positive impact on the immune system. In the same way as social links increase connections can boost our feel-good hormones. So that is to say the type of stuff we do in church, in community, can have all these wonderful effects that science can sort of measure, but we've always known, kind of thing. Okay, so just to finish up, how long have I been talking for? Yeah. I want to bring all together, and I am as aware as you will be. I'm just sort of touching on big subjects here, but let's bring them together and look out into the world we're actually living in. Taking it from the academy into the community, where, you know, I think there is huge pressure to take it, because our world out there's so much trauma and suffering and so on, that there's an imperative here to take it out of webinars and into our community. So let's think about what's happened in COVID as well. It's been globally devastating. But and the oh, let me see. Oh, sorry. Oh, I don't know how to go back. Yes, I do. So just to describe that diagram here. So this, you've got time along the bottom, and the dark blue is the first wave, so a high level of morbidity after the first wave of the pandemic, the second, morbidity after delayed treatment, third, morbidity and impacts from delayed treatment of chronic conditions. But the one to focus on is that light blue wave going up, the psychological impact of COVID and the huge amount of burnout we're seeing, mental health issues, particularly on young folk. Of kids have been through the pandemic. But there's lots of good stuff to build on too, I think. I know as I run an organization which connects health and faith together, I used to have to make the case that the churches have something to say about health and well-being. I now feel I no longer have to do that so often because demand is outstripping our capabilities to meet the needs that we're seeing. Positively, some things have been really, COVID have been, I hesitate to say good, but there've been positive things that have come out of the pandemic. First of all, church and faith communities did a huge amount of practical good to improve the well-being of the community during the pandemic. Two reports have come out on this. They're both called Keeping the Faith. They were initiated by Stephen Timms MP, and they studied the health and well-being impacts of all faith organizations. That's something to build on. Theologically and missiologically, it's been suggested that the COVID pandemic is really a resurrection moment for the church. We have, as I've hinted at, talked about a little bit, we have a theology of health, healing, and resurrection. This speaks powerfully into the context and need we have before us. Pope Francis identified this on his Easter Sunday sermon from the steps of St. Peter's. I don't know if you remembered it. He called the faith in this context of the pandemic as having the contagion of hope. And that's what we have to offer into our communities today. And what I've mentioned just in the last few slides, the type of stuff we do in church, the well-being power of our theology that takes ill health seriously, directly addresses trauma and the healing needs of our world. We have the tools, we have the theology, we have the history, we've got a bit of science to back us up too, to make a real difference in the world we're seeing today, to massively improve the well-being of our communities if we work together. Because COVID has left behind a huge amount of grief, loss of employment. You don't need to tell you any of this. It's exposed vast social inequalities and social justice issues, and there's a huge impact on mental health in the country. Early on in the pandemic, somebody drew my attention to the fact that this is not a pandemic. We are living in a syndemic, S-Y-N, not S-I-N. Now, a syndemic is when a number of impacts come together and combine to have a much greater effect than any one of those impacts individually. There were physical impacts, obviously there was a virus, but there were social impacts, there were financial impacts, there were emotional impacts, and they combined together to be greater than the sum of its parts, what's been called a multiple whammy approach. These impacts interact synergistically, working together, so that if you were Black and poor and frontline, you were more likely to die in the pandemic. So there's a syndemic. Imagine all these different impacts multiplying together. Now, the syndemic lens is an important lens to use in both understanding multiple waves and dimensions of the impact of COVID, and in understanding the multiple issues to be faced in recovery. Now, why am I saying all this in terms of a talk on well-being? Well, because good pastoral response of a church, if a church or a Christian community want to bring a well-being impact, good pastoral response starts with understanding the situation in your area. But I suggest that the good news is that a syndemic impact, multiple things going on to make it all worse, suggests that the health and healing recovery is going to require a multiple response to it. So it's not going to be one fix. There's going to be multiple positive impacts to bring around an improvement in well-being. Focusing briefly on trauma. Now, in general, traumatic experiences can lead to a variety of physiological, psychological, relational, spiritual, and societal responses. Some people emerge from a trauma unscathed, others become changed, others can experience post-traumatic growth. Now, the concept of collective trauma has been developed from disaster and conflict psychology and offers an important level for us. Now, there's strong evidence that the COVID-19 pandemic has been a collective trauma. Collective trauma refers to an event or a series of events that is psychologically or emotionally stressful for a group of people, right? So looking at COVID, most people have experienced some change in their life beyond their control. Some have been personally traumatized, but there's also a good suggestion that we've been collectively traumatized as a society. And the reason I'm talking about this is that the cure for social trauma, for collective trauma, is the same as most trauma treatments, just psychological intervention and so on. But evidence from conflict and war psychology shows a strong positive group identity accompanied by mutual support within the group can contribute to coping and a social cure. So things like connecting with others who are traumatized, singing together, going through rituals together, telling our stories, being listened to, meaning making, are the type of things that secular psychologists believe will lead to the social cure from collective trauma. Now, that's just the stuff that we do in churches. So churches, I suggest, not only do we have the theology and the history and the background to providing healing and well-being, we also do the type of stuff that can help societies recover from collective trauma. We have the history and theology, pastoral ministry, the healing potential, but we also have 2,000 years of experience of running churches. These are syndemic institutions where multiple things happen. You don't just pop to church for mass. You don't just go for the one thing. You go to church, you get a welcome at the door. You might light a candle on the way, and that's a ritual. You sing together, you're using your body and getting the air flowing. You go up and you experience the Holy Communion, the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ, right? But you also have the cup of tea at the end and you have a chat. There's multiple things going on. There's multiple healing moments within church moments, church experience. Not only the words of your brilliant preachers, right? Talking to you about theology and how it all links together. They all might interact synergistically to provide social cure, recovery from collective trauma, true healing and hope at this moment in history. So I would argue to bring it all together, whatever you think of the science behind all this, our churches, our theology, our faith are the ideal hubs for healing and well-being that are most needed in our community in the times that we're living through. So just to conclude, I have aimed to have taken you on a journey to make the case that that human well-being is multifaceted, but that Christian history, theology, and its particular ability to deal with death and suffering make it the highest way to find deep well-being or flourishing in this life. There is abundant evidence in science for the ways that faith and religious practice can boost well-being, but there are significant questions for each of us to work out personally around what the scientific evidence for Christian well-being means in terms of our personal faith, and then what we do with that missiologically and in terms of apologetics. How much do you use it to tell people about Christ? I would argue, however, that well-being of our people in our communities, particularly when we consider the mental health of young people, the rise in self-harm and suicidal ideation, community fragmentation and loneliness, that we cannot wait for science and religion to agree on this, right? We have an imperative to act. The arguments and scientific analysis will continue, in the academy or wherever we want to talk about it, medicine and faith will continue their power struggles. And meanwhile, there is much work for those of us on the ground to take a theology of well-being and human flourishing into complex lives of suffering and struggle, so that the light and love of Christ can shine. So thank you for listening. Thank you so much